And that is a very important point. IPCC authors can only cite information that has already been published in peer-reviewed scientific articles. So my job as part of IPCC was to read a lot of published papers about permafrost, climate change, and synthesize the essential points from those articles and rewrite the material in such a way that it would dovetail with what others in my group had written about related topics like glaciers and sea ice and snow cover and lake ice. The draft chapter was then subject to review by an international cast of experts who were not involved in the production of our chapter. So it's an iterative process. It involves multiple rounds of review. The first one, really, when you think about it, is implicit. Only peer-reviewed literature can be included in the IPCC chapters. The chapters are then subject to at least two more rounds of peer review by expert scientists. But at the end of the process, there's another round of review of a very different nature, and this is what I've alluded to with respect to John. This is by government officials. One of my colleagues on the stage here, John, is going to address this level of review and talk at least a little bit about how this is fueled by political considerations. I'd simply like to point out now that of all the various rounds of peer review, in a very real sense, these rounds of review ensure that the IPCC assessment reports are in fact conservative documents. Every sentence in them is vetted by recognized experts. Well, the chapter to which I contributed was part of the Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability volume produced by IPCC's Working Group 2. Like other chapters in that volume, it has a regional focus. It's concerned with, in my case, with the polar regions, and that, in fact, is the title of the chapter. The amount of work that goes into each of these chapters is really, it's quite extraordinary. The polar regions are exceedingly important in the world context, but because access is difficult and few people occupy these regions, there's a lot remaining to be learned about them, and much of it of a very fundamental nature. So how is it? How can we possibly reconcile these kinds of uncertainties with the rigor of the peer review process? If I could have the first of my slides, please. Great, thanks. Well, I've written this up here. You can read it, but I'll reiterate it. My concern and my contribution to the various IPCC reports in which I've had a hand is with permafrost, which is really a little bit of a misnomer if you want to split hairs. Nothing on Earth is, in fact, permanent. It's probably a better term to refer to it as perennially frozen ground. At any rate, the definition is reasonably precise. It's any subsurface Earth materials that remain frozen for 2 consecutive years or longer. And you'll notice the only criteria that I've used there are time and temperature. It doesn't say anything about the type of material. So if we have warming or thawing permafrost that's composed just of dry bedrock, you don't have much of a problem. But as you can see from from the slides here, very often in many polar environments, very large volumes of ground ice are incorporated within the perennially frozen sediments. And when the energy balance is changed at the surface and some of these things begin to thaw, any infrastructure that's built on top of them may begin to suffer, as you can see from this slide on the right, which is a series of typically Russian garages in the central Siberian city of Yakutsk, very much like a karst sinkhole, the kinds of things you see in Florida. Well, one of the challenges that's facing us is discerning between the effects of climate change on permafrost and more localized human-induced changes. There have been several reports in the popular media in recent years about widespread damage to human infrastructure that's been caused by thawing permafrost, and some have made even unequivocal statements to the effect that climate change is responsible for them. But the effects of heated buildings on underlying ice-rich permafrost have been known for a very long time, as if I can have the next slide, please. The 1983 quote from one of the really fathers of permafrost science in North America, Troy Payway, attests. I'll let you read that at your leisure. But effectively what it says is that we know an awful lot about permafrost, and why in the world, in our land use decisions, aren't we taking it into effect? There's a lot of suffering that goes on, and I'll address that right now. Urbanization has something of a confounding effect on our ability to be able to tease out, to assess a straightforward relationship between climatic change on the one hand and the effects of thawing permafrost on the built environment on the other. In Fairbanks, Alaska, more than 350 structures have been damaged by differential thaw settlement. But that it's by no means apparent that all of this is attributable to climatic change, because the practices that Payway deplored so eloquently some 25 years ago have continued unabated as Fairbanks has grown, and in the manner of most U.S. cities, has taken on a sprawling and overwhelmingly suburban or even exurban morphology. And this leads me to another closely related challenge that's facing us: the need to communicate our knowledge to those working in a wide variety of professions that at first glance may not seem to be very closely related to, in this case, permafrost studies. City and regional planning is one such profession. The linkages here are very straightforward, perhaps even obvious, but through activities like land use mapping, creation of specialized zoning regulations, so forth, that take permafrost into account. But the experience in Fairbanks illustrates that our ties should extend much further into the everyday world of the real estate industry. Very significant amounts of money are involved with the damaged structures, and the effects on often unsuspecting buyers can be quite devastating. Once a structure has been recognized as having been affected by degrading permafrost, it becomes effectively unsaleable because lending organizations will not finance them, can't get insurance for them, can't get mortgages for them. So there are repercussions right through the economy for this sort of thing. Well, we're talking locally here. Well, a final point in this regard: any scientist that's treating a topic that involves the vulnerability of human populations has a responsibility to present facts clearly, without exaggeration, and whenever possible to attach statements of likelihood or probability to them. And this, again, is one of the hallmarks of the IPCC process. And believe me, as a scientist, some of these things are extremely difficult operationally. Some of you may have seen a controversy a few years ago that was surrounding a remote sensing-based warning about avalanche hazard in the Peruvian Andes and the economic damage that resulted when the assessment turned out to be inaccurate after villages had been evacuated. Well, for me, one of the most interesting aspects of that exchange was the communication from a volcanologist. Those people deal with very severe hazards that have a very rapid onset. And he was suggesting that those involved in the avalanche work should develop an explicit and published code of professional conduct, as the volcanologists have already done. I think that all scientists working in the arena of human enterprises, in which human enterprises can be affected profoundly, should develop a code or a series of guidelines about representing our work to the public. And the IPCC has really gone a long way towards doing that. An enterprise of the scope of an IPCC assessment, it really is essential. And I think that the almost unprecedented scrutiny that's been involved in the IPCC review process has served us all very well. Thank you very much.
Fritz, let me just add. Let me just ask you one really simple question about one of your slides that wasn't clear to me, maybe it wasn't clear to others. The picture of the parking lot in Irkutsk. Why would the Russians park vehicles or plant large trailers on that location? Has that ground been solid for 200 years and then all of a sudden it's not solid anymore?
Indeed. Yeah, at first it's Yakutsk rather than Irkutsk, but Irkutsk is outside the permafrost region. But I think that's a very good question, and perhaps I can elaborate a little bit about it. Permafrost science in Russia was, for a very long time, approximately a couple of centuries ahead of that in North America. There's some catch-up now. But there was in fact, in a city like Yakutsk, most of the existing infrastructure, which was built during Soviet times, was in fact engineered with permafrost in mind, with maintenance of permafrost in mind. But this is part of what's fueling a lot of the concerns. And again, the question is very good, because there is a lot of damage. There has been a lot of damage to buildings recently in the city of Yakutsk. So there does seem to be a growing body of evidence suggesting that it's something more than just bad land use planning that's going on now.
Okay, and the other question is not as simple as that. You made a big point of the peer review process and how rigorous it is and vigorous it is, and in the IPCC case, all these scientists all around the world cross-checking and double-checking and triple-checking the work. Does that mean that when the IPCC says global warming is occurring, we can take it on as an act of faith that it is, or are there still legitimate questions to be raised about the evidence?
Well, as a scientist, I'd say there's always legitimate questions to be raised, but I'm not trying to be facetious in the answer. One of the things that I frequently say to people who are beginning to study science is one of the reasons that it's such a fascinating process is for every question that's answered, about 10 more pop up. And I think this is very much the same thing. I think that a lot of the climate change studies really are in their infancy. I think, though, that one of the things that distinguishes the fourth assessment report from its predecessors, the three previous ones, is that there is a much greater degree of certainty associated with it.
Okay, that allows me to segue perfectly to John for the second segment. You alluded to this in your remarks, namely by saying that the peer review process includes scientists reviewing the work of other scientists. But then you said there's a second layer involved in the review process in IPCC, and that involves governments reviewing that science. First of all, have you ever been involved in a process before in which a government reviews your work?
Well, only in the sense that in some of the earlier reviews, peer reviews, government scientists are involved. I've been, as I said, on several of the IPCC assessment reports, actually, I guess all of them, but I was a lead author on the third one, which was published in 2001, and I was right on the cusp of being involved with the government review. So I actually heard a lot about it from my coordinating lead authors, and I guess it's a fairly messy process compared to some of the strictly scientific review. So no, not only in the sense that I saw some of my writing come back a little bit mangled, shall we say.
Improved.
Well, possibly.
The government would say improved.
But I'm going to defer to JB on that.
Okay, John, you want to pick it up from there and take
sure.
the angle you want to take?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a very important part, a very unique part about this matter. Let me just build on what Fritz has said. In a fundamental sense, climate change itself is a problem that we would not know, could not diagnose, could not say much about without science. In a basic sense, science discovered this problem, and without that ability, without that framework of knowledge, we wouldn't have an ability really to assess something in the manner that we're now looking at it. That also means, exactly as Fritz indicated, that we are trying to understand something that is so extraordinarily complex and is so extraordinarily question-filled that we will probably never know in any fundamental sense. I think Fritz said it nicely. Every time you ask a question, 10 more, in the investigation of that question, 10 more are going to be found. We, in that sense, are never going to know for certain in that sense. We can speak in the probabilistic sense that the fourth assessment does, but we are always going to have questions to investigate about this problem. It is, in some ways, a distinction of the modern world. Our problems increasingly are problems that are both discovered by science, and they are increasingly also problems that in order for us to analyze them, we have to go through a process that will have more questions than answers always. That's kind of the world that we are delving into. So I think what Fritz is offering and the peer review process and why we have it is because that's how we're going to deal with the problem that is going to evolve, partly because our knowledge is going to evolve in this way. Okay, that said, the IPCC was then set up to try and address this matter, and as you can probably consider, when you have a problem of this kind that affects virtually everything that human beings do on this planet, almost certainly governments are going to be involved. And I just briefly mentioned in that regard, membership of the IPCC comes from two sources. One is government-nominated scientists. So the government is involved in picking the scientists that are part of the IPCC process, and peer-identified science and researchers. And it is an interesting process in which both kinds of members come into this process and try their best to figure out how to build consensus around these issues. The consensus is partly a consensus around evidence, and a great deal of the discussion, and I think with Ralph's and Fritz's interchange there, a great deal of that discussion has been around evidence for a long time. And we went through, before anybody knew what an IPCC was, out of a very small circle of goofy folks that were interested in this topic, we went through really over 15 years of looking at these kinds of issues without much attention. But in that process, there was always also governmental review. And the reason for governmental review was not simply the government scientists, but that the implications of what was being said could profoundly impact really all nations and all communities on the planet, because the question of, in this process, of how significant is the evidence almost certainly then takes you to the next question, which is what do we do in the face of that evidence? And in fact, in the mission statement of the IPCC, there is an obligation not only to synthesize and report what the available evidence is, but to also synthesize and report what would be the policy implications or the policy applications from that. So from the outset, IPCC took on this process of trying to work at both levels. It's something that I really don't think you can find another model of. I think IPCC, for good or ill, is the pioneer in this regard. It has suffered through a lot of the problems that happen when you are trying to do these dimensions together. It suffers through the process of trying to have government review as well as science review. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the controversies that happened over the most recent policymaker summary for the fourth assessment, where there was a great deal of concern that research findings that were stated carefully in one of the volumes of the assessment were altered in the way in which they were presented in the policymaker summary. And you can probably guess why that would happen, and we can certainly have a conversation about who had what interest in that regard, and I'm sure we'll get into that. But that kind of process has been going on now throughout the young life of the IPCC. Okay. Let me now introduce a dimension in this that really allows me also to bring back, unfortunately, our colleague Dr. Pachauri, who could not be here with us tonight. I would like to just briefly quote from his statements in Oslo when the Nobel was awarded, to give you a sense of just how fast we're going to move from permafrost to policy. So when Pachi was speaking on December 11th in Oslo, one of the points that he wanted to get across, and it has been a fundamental characteristic of his leadership of the IPCC, went as follows. One of the most significant aspects of climate change relates to the equity implications of changes that are occurring and are likely to occur in the future. In general, the impacts of climate change on some of the poorest and most vulnerable communities in the world will prove extremely unsettling. The dilemma that the reporting of evidence has after we can get through the third double-blind peer review process is that it's going to now tell you who is at risk, and often who is at risk is not the same as who is the source of the emissions that are causing those kinds of risks. And that has been, I would offer, one of the thorniest problems that the IPCC has had to wrestle with. Dr. Pachauri was a leader in this regard in trying to look at that issue, and that's really how we came to meet back in the late 80s on the question of how to properly state the equity problem and bring it forward in the policy domain. Dr. Pachauri has 2 PhDs, that many things that separate Pachi from the rest of us, only one of which is that he has 2 PhDs. But interestingly, he has 1 PhD in the science and he has 1 PhD in policy. And in that sense, I think he is a personification of the kind of integration that's needed in order to address the problem. Okay, well, let me give you a sense of the equity problem. If you take the best evidence that we have available at this point of the level of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions that we must make in order to restore some stability in the carbon cycle, it is that we roughly need to cut our emissions by a minimum of 60% below 1990 levels, and we have about until 2050 to do that. If you take the 1990 population as your benchmark to say what is the budget for each human being for that purpose, that means that we each have 3.3 tons of carbon dioxide per person per year to release in order for us to be approximately within the balance of that carbon cycle. The United States is at 21 tons of carbon dioxide per person per year. All of Europe is well over 14, 15 tons of carbon dioxide per person per year. The most energy efficient industrial economy in the world, Japan, is in about 12 to 13 tons of carbon dioxide per person per year. The entire part of the industrial model and the urban model is well outside what is needed in order for us to address this problem. Against that background, nearly all of sub-Saharan Africa is less than 1 ton of carbon dioxide per person per year. India is about 2 tons, 2.5 tons. China this year has moved just slightly above the 3.3 tons. But you can get the point very quickly that there is a huge disparity between those who are the sources of the emissions and then those who are going to be at risk of the consequences of those emissions. That, in brief, is the equity problem. It has a social dimension. Inside any society, including American society, there are also vast differences in these emission profiles. But the core problem that we have both within a country and across countries is how do we find a way to act, to move forward, so that we all converge around something that will be sustainable. And frankly, it appears that the problem cannot be achieved, that sustainability problem, getting to what we need to have some reduction in the volatility that we are now experimenting with in the climate system. In order to do that, we essentially have to also solve the equity problem. I just simply don't know of any model that can show you how we can solve the sustainability problem without addressing the equity problem. And the equity problem means, in particular, that the more wealthy countries of the world are going to have to significantly reduce their emissions. And in order to reduce their emissions, they will not be able to change. This is a big problem that I think is coming forward to that Pachi and others have worked on as well. That problem is that we can't simply solve it by changing the exhaust chemistry of our energy system or doing other sorts of simply technological solutions. We have to basically change the way in which we are developing in order to solve this problem over the long run. That does not mean that technology solutions aren't part of what we need to do. It means that they can't be all of what we need to do. And that's going to be tough, I think, particularly in places like Europe and North America, where a lot of the debate is about how fast to move forward on changing the exhaust chemistry without actually changing the basic development trajectory. That's going to be tough, and if we don't solve that problem, how do you think we're going to get China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, and other countries that are fast increasing their carbon profiles and increasing their emissions, how are we going to get them to the table and agree on a common target for this purpose? That, in essence, is the dilemma. Science may not have intended early on to get into this problem. Technologists may not have seen themselves as getting into this sort of problem. But at the end of the day, this is the problem now that we face. And as we move forward, the IPCC is trying to figure out how can we link the dialogue of science, the dialogue of technology, and the dialogue of policy to find some way for us to come with a consensus of what we need to do. It's never going to be easy. It's going to be fraught with complexities, and I will just close with an example of how this kind of problem has evolved. When this matter first started, one of the things that we didn't really have were carbon emission profiles that we could use at a unit level so that we could just inspect where are the emissions coming from and what might we do to resolve those. And so national inventories were set up. And in those national inventories, there were a series of greenhouse gases that were monitored for this purpose. And an organization, I think, with a very strong, solid research base called World Resources Institute in Washington, D.C., was given the challenge of pulling together those national inventories and making them consistent. And along the way, as they were making those national inventories consistent, they noted that there were very high levels of methane release, which, this is not a chemistry class, but the methane release is more forcing than carbon dioxide in that sense, okay? And they noticed that those methane releases were coming from countries like China, India, and other countries whose per capita overall greenhouse gas emissions were low, but the methane was up. So they made a proposal early on, which they thought was a very sensible policy proposal, which is, can't we go after the methane releases first? The response came from a rather, I'd say, intellectually very interesting and certainly provocative organization called the Center for Science and Environment in New Delhi in India. And Anil Agarwal, who has now left us, but Sunita Narain is still guiding the center in this regard. They wrote a piece and said there's a difference between luxury emissions and survival emissions. The methane you're talking about is coming from a rural population that depends upon those activities that release that methane for their every survival. That's different from the emissions that come from vehicles that seem to grow without end in size in order to travel on roads. And I got to tell you, when colleagues at the World Resources Institute got this rather abrupt criticism that they were collecting data. And in collecting data, they had taken a political position in the way in which they had collected data and presented it. That was really a rude awakening. And that's the problem that we now exist in. For most part, this problem has been addressed as a nation-state problem. But as my colleague will now introduce, the nation-state problem is only part of the issue that we're going to have to address on the policy side. And I'll let Yda talk with you a bit about the world economy and how it plays in. So that's sort of my comment. Thank you.
John, can I just throw a couple of follow-ups at you while your comments are fresh in our mind? If we'll never know and both of you have commented on this, if we'll never really know the answer to this scientific question, the measurement question, and the data questions, does that mean that it's okay to say, well, we're never going to know, so let's wait until we find out, or let's figure it out before we jump in and make rash policy decisions?
Yeah, it's a really, really important question, and that, of course, has been an effort in some ways in the debate to say there's controversy, and we have a sitting president that has offered that there is controversy because we can never know and there's uncertainties and all the rest. But I think anybody who does serious research knows that there always are uncertainties. The real issue, and I think the strategy of the fourth assessment, I think, was a valuable one to answer this question that Ralph is raising, is to say it's not a matter of whether we will ever remove uncertainty. The question really is, under that uncertainty, if we use that as the cloak for inaction, what are the risks. And if we don't take that cloak, but we instead say there's enough evidence for us to say it's far more prudent and appropriate for us to act than it is for us to use uncertainty as a means for inaction. And that's, I think, what the fourth assessment has come forward and said. The evidence in that regard is compelling. We need to treat this problem as a problem that we're still going to learn a lot about, and we may make some errors in the advice that we give to one another as to what to do. But it's better that we begin taking action soon, because the risks that we are taking if we don't act are so much greater.
And you touched on this, and I don't know whether you really want to expand on it, but you teased my interest, so I'm going to follow up. Dr. Pachauri himself was subject to a kind of political pressure when he was appointed, or elected rather, to the not appointed, elected to the chairmanship of this committee. Since he's not here, I mean, we would have asked him that if he were here, but what was it like to go through that? But briefly, can you sort of summarize what happened there, and how did it come out? How did he end up being the chair?
Well, I think that's a complex problem. There are a lot of different actors involved in this, but to get directly to the point, there was a government that is the government of the largest emitter of CO2 emissions in the world, the United States government, who wanted a change in the chairmanship. And they lobbied strongly that there would be a change in the chairmanship. Dr. Pachauri was seen in some ways because, at the time, the worry was that if you put an atmospheric scientist back in charge of the thing, that atmospheric scientist might lead a process that would say the evidence is so strong that we need to act yesterday. And the thought was that if you had somebody who wasn't an atmospheric scientist, and I'll explain in the sort of the organizational structure and the underlying politics of the IPCC itself, why this is. The thought was that if you did something different, maybe you could slow down this process and maybe change the outcome. The IPCC is organized into 3 working groups. As Fritz mentioned, he works with the impacts group, working group 2. Working group 3 is the mitigation group, which works mainly with the policy and adaptation questions. And working group 1 is the science group, which works on the models and, as best we can, understanding what those models can and can't tell us. Dr. Pachauri was subjected, I feel, quite unfairly to a political process that was the wrong thing for him to have been brought into in this regard. I think he stood with honor in the middle of this kind of criticism and this gaming that was going on in the process. And whatever they thought they were going to get when they said, let's go with Dr. Pachauri, I think they didn't get what they thought they were going to get. His demand that the equity issue be dealt with as part of the IPCC's obligation, and his demand that we deal with these kinds of vulnerabilities that communities face, I think, if anything, elevated the interest of the wider world in the IPCC's work, and in the process, I think, has built that growing demand for us to change. And I think more rapidly than, well, I don't want to say more rapidly than any, but certainly I think he has led a very vigorous campaign for us to change, and to change now.
Okay, let's turn to our final contributor here, Dr. Yda Schreuder, whose book title is The Corporate Greenhouse, Climate Change Policy in a Globalizing World.
Wow, that's a mouthful and a heavy title.
It is a mouthful, but that's all right, that's good. We'll read it when it comes out.
Thank you.
You're all committed, by the way, to buying copies when it comes out.
Have a chance to see the draft.
Yda.
Thank you. So I'm going to change gears a little bit. I'm not the IPCC expert here. I know enough about it to feel comfortable speaking here from this podium, but I'm going to change gears a little bit to discuss, in addition to equity issues, something that I think we need to bring into the discussion, and that is a non-state or non-nation entity, the corporation. You know, we talk about a ever faster growing global economy and a very rapidly increasing foreign trade between countries. The economic product we manufacture, we produce and consume is enormous and has increased over the last 2-3 decades at an enormously fast pace. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a moment. But I want to start off by the way of introduction, and that is to go back to that equity issue. From the very beginning, when we began to discuss climate change policy, and that goes back to the 1980s, found its more formalized foundation at the Earth Summit in 1992. And then ultimately that was when the UNFCCC, the Framework Convention, was formed, and then resulting in the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. So that's sort of the framework we've worked with. All this is based on that nation-state concept. We talk about, and JB just referred to it, the national emissions accounting and the national emissions reduction commitments. It's always the nation-state that is the entity in discussion. Now, in the debates centered on the climate change, we had two groups of countries, and I wasn't to name them by their UNFCCC name, Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries, but let me just briefly say here, basically the world is divided between highly developed countries, industrialized countries, wealthy nations, and the developing world. And we heard references to the US and the European Union and Japan being all well above the per capita average, 3.3. And the rest of the world lower than that per capita. So from the very beginning, this was recognized, and so the framework we work with in the policy area distinguishes between these two groups. It were the highly developed countries that were to take the lead, hopefully would commit to indeed binding emissions reduction targets. That was the Kyoto Protocol. We all know the United States withdrew from the protocol, but still committed to the UNFCCC. It agreed to help work towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And then the rest of the world not asked to come on board till at the later stage, perhaps, but at least for the time being not committed under stringent emissions reduction targets to do so. Now, from the beginning, this debate centered on who is to blame for what we have up there in the atmosphere and who is to pay as a consequence. And in that sense, we sort of maintain a polluter pays principle. And of course, if you look at it historically, ever since the Industrial Revolution, it were the Northern Hemisphere countries that I just referred to. The accumulation up in the atmosphere is mostly the result of this historic process of industrial manufacturing and the transportation system we've put in place over the decades and centuries now. So the North, which benefited from this industrial revolution in an economic sense, was also called to action to indeed first act. I think you can say that about the whole process. Now, John here to my left just referred to that fair share in terms of emissions per capita and referred to how much more per capita we consume than the rest of the world, that is including the EU and Japan. Now, there's a significant difference, in my mind at least. But then we also have at the same time, and that's where we need to now act on, the call from the IPCC that indeed it's not enough to talk any longer about 10% reductions. We're talking 60 to 80% if we want to stabilize that level in the atmosphere. That is a totally different game which John here referred to, and technologically perhaps not the only way to deal with. That is a lifestyle issue in a way. We do have these very steep increases in emissions around the world which require very steep cuts to get anywhere with this. And so under the current regime we have, that is the Kyoto Protocol, there are really not too many countries that have committed seriously to cutting that level, even at the not even 10% level. The EU is the largest bloc of countries, and then, of course, a number of other industrialized countries, former Soviet Union, Russia, Japan. The US is noticeable absent from that list. Now, to change direction here a little bit in my presentation, as we have, this is to throw a little bit of a monkey wrench in the whole affair here. We've kept debating along these north-south lines for all this time. The stalemate, as I see it, but as many perceive it too, we're in now in the discussion starting up for the post-Kyoto era. We have to come to terms with the fact that we have a global economy that is a free trade regime that is very much geared towards ever more global production, and that clearly shows how the world's economic product has grown at an enormous fast rate, and international trade flows along with that. And this is where I want to raise some questions, make a few observations and raise some questions. How do we deal with this reality of the very rapidly expanding global economy and foreign trade? How to account for the product, manufacturing and consumed, and the greenhouse gas emitted by multinational corporations, which are the main actors in this global economy. I will give you a few numbers here and a few statistics in a moment. But how do we deal with that non-state actor in the global economy? How and to what extent should globally agreed to emissions reduction standards or requirements be incorporated into the international trade regime? Should developing countries be expected to forego the development through industrialization as they, if in a position to do so, tend to pursue industrial growth because of strict emission standards and regulations which industrialized countries at the present time and at the time of their development did not have to adhere to? We developed, since the Industrial Revolution, without carbon constraints. It wasn't part of the cost of production. We didn't consider this. This is from the last 3 decades. We call upon the rest of the world to forgo, if we put them in that position, to restrain their emissions at this point. We put them in a straitjacket, in a way, something we didn't have to endure. If developing countries are forced to or asked to impose and enforce stricter emissions regulations, who will foot the bill? Who's going to pay for that? So these are some of the issues that I'm trying to address in my book. One of the issues in relationship to that, and that I think really ought to matter to us, is the great potential of relocation of production. Now I'm talking specifically from the experience of the European Union, the bloc that has embarked on an emissions reduction scheme through emissions trading, where carbon emissions do have a price, where it is now part of the cost of production. Now, under those circumstances, multinational corporations, be they headquartered here in the United States, as many are, or in Europe or in Japan, tend not to, at this point, decide on further investments if they are energy-intensive, high-carbon-intensive industries, let's say iron and steel, aluminum, a number of metal-working industries, or other industries that you do use a lot of energy and are large carbon emitters, not to, or hold off on further investments in Europe. Instead, branch out towards other parts of the world where they may have already established some manufacturing presence, but expand there. Come to mind, of course, China, India, Brazil, some other countries that have an infrastructure are in place or rapidly expanding such an infrastructure in order to accommodate large-scale production of energy-intensive industries. Now, as the atmosphere, climatic atmosphere, does it matter who emits? No, it doesn't matter who emits. Fact is that under the present strategy of multinational corporations, they do locate where they can compete most profitably in the global economy. That's the fact. So ironically, with the efforts made on part of some blocks of countries, the net result could potentially be relocation at a large scale. Yeah? And that relocation is not necessarily from Europe to China. In fact, the largest amount of carbon leakage, as it is sometimes referred to, is to the United States. Yes. That is a very sad part of the whole story. Now, I had Ralph make up a nice overhead for me. Could we have that?
It's up.
It's up. Okay. This is the scheme that I have used when I talk about these things. Now, we do have the climate up there, the atmosphere. We have global emissions. They can come from different parts of the world. I have the world divided up in two parts. Country A, let's call it abatement country. Not necessarily, or not only Annex I countries, because the United States is not an abatement country, but it is an Annex I country. And then non-abatement countries. And now we have this large flow of investment and trade going from different parts of the world to another part of the world. We have the regime that rules that activity, and that's the World Trade Organization. It works on the principles of free trade, reducing import duties, facilitating the flow of goods and investment around the world. So in this scheme, we have a problem. When your country or your block of country conducts national or EU-wide climate change policy and puts a price on carbon, we can see, and we begin to notice this, and certainly in discussions at the EU level, that there is a shift occurring to non-abatement countries. Now, as I said, the atmosphere doesn't care where it comes from. Yeah? But this is the issue that I think we failed to address. Has in fact, I hardly dare say that, but has not been addressed at a global level. And if you ask me, how should we address that? I hardly dare make very serious proposals. My task and my incentive to write the book was to point this out. But I do want to give you just briefly a bit of a feel for the extent of this global trade as it now is. This is based on 2004 World Investment Report. There are at least 61,000 multinational corporations around the world with almost 1 million foreign affiliates, subsidiaries, other units they contract with. Now, this amounts to 10% of the world's GDP, but for 1/3 of the world's exports. Yeah? The estimated trade among related parties, that is, multinational corporations, its various subsidiary and contracting parties, yeah, represents about half of all U.S. imports and 1/3 of all U.S. exports. And we don't know exactly the figures. In fact, we don't really know all that much about what is called intra-firm trade. Transfer of goods and services between subsidiary and headquarters or other entities of the corporation. Yeah. This is not really open public information. It's done through what they call transfer trade, transfer pricing. It's not really known how this is put together, other than if you have access to company records. But it's not statistically reported exactly as trade. So that gives you an idea of the amount of goods trades around the world, and this can be finished goods for consumers in the United States from the assembly line in Indonesia, or parts, say, from a plant in the United States to be assembled in South Korea and shipped back somewhere else. Yeah. So this is the sort of trade or activity we're talking about.
Yda, can I ask you to wrap up?
Yeah, I will leave you with a few questions here. So the issue is, who benefits from that trade? And who should pay for the emissions that emerge from that sort of activity? Are it the shareholders of the multinational corporations, many residing here or in Europe, our pension funds, you and me? Or we as consumers who benefit from no cost to carbon in the goods we consume? Yeah. Who is to assume the burden of paying for greenhouse gas emission reductions from multinational investment around the world? Is it fair to call developing countries responsible for the resulting high emissions that result from that? In other words, back to the question, who is to blame and who's to pay? And whose emissions are it anyway?
Okay, thank you very much. Before we go to your questions, just one quick one to the IPCC people. Does the IPCC try to track the data that Yda said was not publicly available? That is, measure emissions on the basis of not geographically where they come from or geopolitically where they come from, but economically where they come from? Anybody do that?
Yeah, there are efforts to track part of the emissions that are brought up by trade. But in the end, the answer is we don't, exactly as Yda is indicating, we don't have at this time an accounting system that would allow us to actually do that in a way that governments would agree and that policies would be written. So there are efforts, there are models. The mitigation group has worked on this issue, has presented things on this issue, but we are far from addressing the very good questions that Yda asked.
And that's another example of where politics enters into it. Exactly. You might never be given the permission or the tools to go after that kind of data because the politicians would say, hands off, baby, that's too volatile information. Okay. Well, so there's the good way of getting politics involved in this. We'll start taking questions, and I'll go back to my old policy, which is I'm going to alternate questions between students and non-students in the audience so everybody gets a shot. Yes, sir.
I have two questions. One is you spoke about the relationship between methane production and the system survival. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the connection. Are cows really the most dangerous animals? Is right production produce methane? And the second question is something different, and that is, can any of you comment on the effect of zero population growth would have to solve our problem?
Why don't we take just the first of those two questions so we get more questions in. Luxury versus survival emissions.
Yeah, the issue, of course, is the issue that was being raised was whether there were farming methods that could reduce. You don't need to worry about cattle. That's not the source of the problem, or their stomachs. That's not what. But the problem that was being raised had to do with since there were very large methane emissions there, and from the perspective of another way of looking at things. How much would it cost to change that agricultural method versus what it would cost to change out the industrial process of making steel? The thought was it's cheaper to do it over there, until, of course, the argument then hit the ground, and you talked about who is going to have to change and how you're going to have to change, and why is it that we're looking that way. So, and all of those questions are questions that the original inventory was never intended to answer. The inventory was simply, by weight, here is this gas, here is that gas, and I think innocently in that sense, but found out that innocence is no excuse for in politics for criticism, for keeping yourself from being criticized. It just was a problem that even chemistry itself was going to raise policy and political questions, and there was no way out of it at that point.
Question from a student. Yes, ma'am. I'm going to paraphrase your question because I think a lot of people couldn't hear it. Stand up and shout liar, pants on fire if I screw it up. I think the question is, the IPCC is a child of the United Nations system. And as such, we've already exposed tonight, our three panelists have exposed tonight a variety of problems with the IPCC process, for all its good things also.
Yes.
But the questioner is asking, is there another way to bring it to, for example, bring the corporate data into scrutiny, to deal with the luxury versus survival emissions and all these other issues? Maybe taking it out of the UN and putting it someplace else is a better way to do it. Fair enough characterization? Okay. Fritz, do you want to?
I'm going to pass on.
You're going to pass? Okay. Yda?
Well, I will just say a little bit about this. There is a discussion going on right now among the different corporations in a, say, particular sector, say, steel sector, aluminum sector, cement, some energy-intensive industry, where among themselves they're beginning to discuss how can we, as a sector worldwide, get a handle on this. There's of course the competition that these corporations encounter, but if they can come to agree to all follow best practices and check each other on that as a industry association worldwide, there may be one way that we can get a handle on. Now, I'm not sure if that's going to happen. By the nature of capitalism, we are competing. So I haven't seen it ever happen, but that is the discussion going on.
Okay. Question from a non-student? Yes.
You're a student, though, right?
Okay. I think we're alternating, so I'm going to do that. Yeah. Otherwise, it's hard to enforce otherwise. Non-student, anybody? Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm from the technology community, and I frequently go to technology conferences. And I hear marvelous proposals for research. I'll learn how to turn Nevada into a really solar plant. Yes. And we will make enough electricity to power the United States. Let's go back and build more nuclear plants. What I fail to see in the technical conferences, and what I fail to see in the political process, is personal leadership. And I notice a lack of comments from the public around, well, let's take out what. So is he committed to a lower carbon footprint in his life? Or is he committed to capital-intensive technology solutions which are not affordable and create this disparity between the haves and the have-nots? So where's the forum where I hear people discussing opportunities for personal action?
Okay. I'm not sure that's a question that any of you would care to address or are competent to address, but help yourself if you want. The question is, essentially, is there a forum other than the scientific ones and the industrial ones where individuals can make their own commitments to change their lifestyles appropriately? Anybody want to tackle that? No. Yes?
I think your question is a very good one. I think that the issue that we have to deal with, how much we make it personal, but is an important dimension of this, but I don't think we're going to be able to avoid it. The technical and the policy community are depending upon each other. The technology community is offering solutions that plug in. It's a sort of plug-and-play approach, and the policy community likes that. I mean, that's if you ask a politician, what can I get voted in, and you tell me, you mean I get to have that trade and growth and all that keeps going, but the emissions chemistry changes? I like that. So there is a difficulty that we have in the modern systems and how technology, economy, and policy work together. That personal leadership is going to have to be fundamentally part of it. I think that's quite true, but I think Yda also is quite correct in that we didn't always have the same model of economic development that we have today. And if we are going to have a world without the climate change problem, that world probably depends upon us making a change in our economic development pattern in the way that got us to modernity. So I think the personal is part of it, but I think the personal is only going to work to the extent that we've also made the changes that Yda was highlighting.
In other fields like philanthropy, for example, there are experiments being made now that involve personal commitments, in some cases at a very micro level, but in large numbers. Is there an arena in the energy and environment field where individuals could determine their own footprints, their own emissions in a simple way, and then make personal commitments? Now, I'm not speaking about leadership now. You were talking about leadership, but we're talking about leadership at an individual level. Is that being explored in this area, and is it viable or significant, or essentially insignificant by comparison with the size of the problem? Anybody just briefly, Yda, maybe comment on that?
I know you can go online and calculate your own footprint, and then when you get on the plane, you can put some carbon credits. Buy some credits.
Does it amount to a hill of beans?
I don't know. You see, I think you're now calling on how guilty do I feel?
It's a feel-good thing rather than
feel-good thing, maybe. Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure. You see, I think in global structural terms, and I see the confines in that arena. I'm not sure. So often I think we feel that, all right, now I can do something about this, but nobody else cares, so why should I? I think that feeling predominates so very often.
All right, let's go back over here. How much are attributable to non-human causes?
Human, non-human.
Okay. Fritz?
We're putting this to you.
Yeah. Non-human.
Is there anything you could characterize as non-human?
Yeah, that's a question. It's a bit like a Matryoshka doll or an onion or something. You begin taking it apart, and a lot of interconnections in there. I'm sorry, I didn't really hear the question very well. It was...
Is there some portion... You want to shout it out again,
yeah.
Joe? Or?
Based on the facts gathered, were reported by the IPCC that are subject to peer and governmental review. What portion results indicate a lack of human-induced climate change, environmental factors, universal factors outside of the planet, and how results like incorporated into or omitted from other reports?
Okay, yeah. Very good question. And again, I don't mean to come down on the side of indeterminacy, but the answers are not all in by a long shot. But it's a very well posed question, and it has a lot to do with obviously natural cycles of climate change. I can remember being in graduate school in probably the first couple of years of my PhD program. The common knowledge was that we were entering another glacial cycle. And along about 1980, you began to hear about the carbon dioxide problem. Some of the various sources began coming in, and I think the jury really isn't in, but I think that probably the best way that I could answer that question, as I say, is a very indeterminate one, but it would be certainly to continue and not de-emphasize in any way the scientific research into past climate changes. Things like coring the Antarctic ice sheet, the Greenland ice sheet, the pelagic environment, and trying to tease out those things. There are an awful lot of interconnected things, as I indicated in a very small way, just with the example of permafrost in and around Fairbanks. It's a very difficult kind of thing to tease out those relationships. And it's a combination of monitoring, empirical analysis of empirical data, and punctuated by modeling.
But didn't the IPCC's last report, the one that was issued last year, that I think you worked on, maybe I'm mixing apples and oranges here, but layman's view, didn't the IPCC grapple with that issue and come to the conclusion that with 90% certainty, at least, admittedly, 10% uncertainty, so not conclusive, but a lot less than indeterminative conclusion that the data pointed to human responsibility.
Oh, yeah, and I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. The question was how much.
Yes.
And
how much is in the 10%?
I was perhaps splitting some hairs.
Okay.
This is 10% possibility that it isn't anthropogenic. So sorry to split hairs there.
No, that's all right. Yeah. All right. Yes, ma'am. Not sure I know what your question is there, ma'am, but if you're saying that politicians in this country aren't talking about the issue, I don't think that's right, and not fair to pose that.
No, yeah, she didn't mean it.
All right, John, you want to talk about consensus in the political arena?
Yeah, maybe I can try. I think in the U.S. case, we have had a problem, particularly at the national level. There's been political gridlock rather than political action. But as one who has had to give talks in many parts of the world and had to answer the question, don't you come from that country that's the largest emitter and is not participating in this process? So I ask people, don't give up on the American people. And maybe this is a little bit too provocative, but I say maybe our national administrations have, but I don't think the people have. So at the same time that we don't have this is not meant as entirely feel-good. There are 29 states in the United States that have climate change action plans. They are tying decisions that are being made in a variety of policy areas to climate impacts. Notwithstanding that the American national administration can't make agreement on this kind of thing. Similarly, there are 29 states in the United States, they're not all the same, that have obligations that if you wish to sell electricity into their markets, that you have to have a percentage of that electricity come from non-carbon sources. So I would say that the American case is a bit confusing at the moment, a bit conflicted at the moment, but I think there are elements of leadership that are taking place. They are not currently occurring At the national level, there is, I think, a worldwide hope that there will be a change in that condition after the next presidential election. I would say that in terms of who is taking leadership at the national level in other places, and this often gets me in trouble, but if you look at some of the policy initiatives that have been passed in China and in India in the last 5 years and ask what they are committing to, and look at it against what the corporate community have not made as probably less known. This is odd. China has a more strict fuel economy standard for vehicles than the United States or Europe. So there is leadership. We need to be a part of that leadership, but we're not right now doing that very well.
Just a footnote, since Dr. Pachauri would have been here, and I'm sure would have mentioned this somehow, he would have made this point. One of the other things he's missing by having missed by the flight having been canceled is he was going to have a meeting with Arnold Schwarzenegger in California that illustrates the point that it may be national leadership problem, but it's not necessarily a partisan problem. It's very much one where you've got to look carefully around the country. So I think it would only be fair to say that he would have had a photo op with Schwarzenegger and shown that there are people. I don't need to go any further than that. Okay, yes, sir, way in the back, right.
What do you guys see as the next step? Not necessarily in the technology sector and like home electronics, but that more than transportation. I think for the corporations and stuff like that, like where moving to different places across the whole of the world to do that would be useful. But I feel like what would be the next step in terms of kind of being able to change their future production of emissions, their emissions in general?
Who's they in your last sentence? Now we're talking corporations. Okay, I thought you were talking about individuals. Okay.
There were many steps in your.
Yeah, I know. Choose one of them. What are the next steps for corporations that could be effective, that you could foresee as being effective in helping to solve this problem?
Well, I just alluded to this when I said that is, and I know this is the case in the European Union. Example, steel manufacturers. There are maybe 8 major steel producers, large corporations. Mittal in India, or what do we have here? U.S. Steels, United States. Still called U.S. Steel, I believe. Anyway, the number of corporations that control, and I just read the latest statistic, they control these 8, 90% of all the steel manufactured. If these 8, and they're spread out over at least 8, if not more countries, but if they, as 8 companies, could come to agree, all right, we talk about this, right? Best practices in agriculture, best practices in controlling emissions. Yeah, we could, conceivably, if they agree to cooperate, get a handle on this. Now, as I mentioned, I still question the whole concept of multinational corporations is to outdo each other in competition with each other through mergers. We hear and listen to the radio. You hear about these things all the time. Yeah, they operate multinationally so that they can be in a better competitive position. So I don't really believe that they're moving in that direction, but that's what they could do.
Before we thank our panelists tonight, a couple of quick reminders. Our next Global Agenda program is 2 weeks from tonight, same place, same time. New York Times environmental writer Andrew Revkin will be our guest to discuss the media's role in the politics of climate change. If you would like to receive email notices of programs like these, please clearly print your email address on one of the bright orange sheets out in the lobby on your way out. If you're already receiving emails about this, don't put it on there again. It only makes work. Now, let's thank our guests tonight, Dr. John Byrne, Yda Schreuder, and Fritz Nelson for their insights and their eagerness to step into the breach of the program.